Welcome to our Friends Talk today. We have Professor Timon Screech here to talk to us. We have Dr. Mary Redfern from the Chester BD who's going to introduce Professor Timon Screech. We, as usual, will do a Q&A at the end, and if anyone has any questions throughout, we will answer them at the end, so just pop them into the Q&A box. I'm excited for this talk, and we've quite a few people here today, so it's great to see, and I will hand over to Mary now. So thanks, Emil.
Thank you, Sai. It's really my great pleasure today to have our speaker, Professor Timon Screech. It was one of my first things when Sai was asking for suggestions for the public program. I was like, see if you can get him, because his books are so wonderful, and he's going to be introducing us a little bit, his new one today, which I can show you here, and which Rie will hopefully soon have in the shop as well. But all of his books are written in such a beautiful way that really enriches sort of not just the history of art, but the place of art, the role of art, how art's used, why art is there in Edo, Japan, and so many interesting perspectives that I've found really engaging in all my years studying Japanese art. So really thrilled to have him here today. He completed his PhD at Harvard, and he's currently Professor of History of Art at SOAS, but actually, as you'll see today from his wonderful backdrop, he's joining us from Japan. Probably not quite in that particular location, but it looks very nice anyway. And he's currently visiting professor at the Tama Art University in Tokyo. And it's wonderful to have him here because it's just, his new book gives new insight into Edo, into this city. So the exhibition will be taking one look at it, but I know that Tim will today introduces another way of seeing this city in a completely fresh and interesting way. And power and magic are two of the most exciting topics that I can imagine. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing his talk today, and I know that you all will be too. So I will come back for the Q&A at the end, but for now, I'd just like to hand over to Professor Timon Screech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very generous introduction. And it's a great honor to be, I can't say invited back because I'm not with you, but I have wonderful memories of attending exhibitions and even giving a couple of talks at your museum in the past. And in fact, long, long ago, when I first began thinking about Edo urban planning, I developed my ideas in a couple of lectures I gave at the Chester BT, and I'd be very interested to know if anyone was there or remembers having been there, because what I said then grew into the book, which came out finally in the autumn. So I'm really delighted to come back to sort of say thank you for having sent me out on a course, which I hope you'll think, if you can get around to reading the book, has been a reasonably successful attempt to bring to people's minds what this amazing city of Edo was. Now, I'll of course show you slides, but let me just say a few things to start with. That Edo is today, of course, Tokyo. And being Tokyo, it means it's one of the most important, biggest, flourishing, exciting, amazing cities in the world. I'm speaking to you obviously Rome, cities with thousands and 2,000 years of habitation. Edo came out of virtually nothing in the year, well, 1 year, of course, it grew up slightly, but 1590 is the year given. And that was the year in which Tokugawa Ieyasu, a great warlord of the period, Japan is in a civil war at the time, he entered the area, defeated a long-standing military alliance that was already there. Rather than occupying the castle town, used as grew, and of course, in the time available today, I can't possibly give you a history of it, nor even history of Edo art, but I'd like to suggest to you a few areas of interest. And when the exhibition finally opens, I sadly think I won't get to it, but I hope that you'll be able to put the beautiful things you'll see from the show in a bit of a context after what I've been able to say to you today. As you heard, I'm delighted to answer questions at the end. So let me begin by sharing my screen. I hope you can all see that. Let's put the slideshow on. So this is Edo. The map is drawn looking southwest. It's a bit annoying. I tried to Photoshop it around the other way, but as you can see, it's sort of an angled view, so I can't rotate it without it looking really strange. So anyway, the river running down into the Bay of Edo, today's Bay of Tokyo, and that is a fairly convenient and safe spot. So the thing to note about Edo is it's on the water. Now, Kyoto, the long-standing capital, was not on the water, and the castle that Ieyasu had destroyed, driving out the previous alliance, which he could have rebuilt and lived in, was not on the water either. So he wants a port. And if you think 1590, well, you know from your Western history, this is the period of discovery, the Portuguese going around and the Spanish, and then following them, the Dutch and the English. And so the Japanese are aware of world trade. Japan had, I say had because it's all gone now, about 1/3 to 1/2 of all the silver ever mined on Earth has come out of Japan. And of course, people desperately wanted it. Spain controlled most of the rest of the silver available in Latin America. So the Dutch and the English and even the Portuguese need ways to get their own silver. And Japan has plenty of it. So they came. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the warlord who's taking control here, was interested in this, and he sent diplomatic letters to the King of Spain, the King of England, the stadtholder of the United Provinces of Holland, even to the governor of the Philippines, Mexico, all these places. So Japan is very much part of trade movements at that time. It would become more closed later on, but Edo begins as an international city. However, the Spanish and the others came with gunboats. They had cannon, even though they said that they were trading. If you didn't trade in the way they liked, you might come to a sticky end. So Edo has the advantage of being a port, but within a bay, and some gun emplacements at the entrance to the bay would be enough to keep out ships, or even if they could get through, actually the waters are quite shallow. So a large ship of the kind that could come to Japan from Seville or from Acapulco could not sail right up to Edo anyway. So in all kinds of ways, it's a propitious site. You may think, in that case, why wasn't there already a city there? Edo has one huge disadvantage, which is that there's earthquakes all the time. We had a very big one a couple of weeks ago, and I was woken up by it. Today, of course, we're not afraid of them, but in the past, people were terrified. They didn't just knock down your house on you. Worse than that is that they overturned braziers and cooking stoves, and it's fires. So Edo was just a very dangerous kind of topography in which to build a city, but Tokugawa Ieyasu decides to do it. So here we are, 1590, not a lot there. But if we leap on, sorry, this is a little bit out of focus, to a generation or so further on, Tokugawa Ieyasu set up his regime, and then he he requested the emperor, who can't say no, to nominate him to the role of shogun. And you all know the name shogun. It's the military ruler of Japan. There'd been such a person since about the year 1200. Two dynasties of them, actually. But the last shoguns had pretty much lost their power 100 years before. So it wasn't obvious that he would claim that title. He could have taken other ranks. Previous warlords had been made imperial regents and ministers of state and things, but he didn't want to do that. He sets his regime up far from Kyoto in this new city. And he of course, he died, his son took over, his son died, his grandson took over. And so here we're looking about the time of the third shogun. Cities got bigger. It's also been manipulated by landfills and by drainage. The area is quite swampy. So you can see that the moats don't only protect the castle in a kind of circular way, as moats often do, but they served also to drain the swamps out into the bay. The map is color-coded, so we have orange is for the samurai class, the rulers, the shogun and his elite. In fact, they were by far from numerous in terms of the city population, but you can see they've got a lot of space. They've got also all the best bits up in the hills. If the land is marshy and Japan has fairly heavy rainfall, then lower areas will be swamped, and there will be filthy streams coming down and effluvium, so everything. So being up is better, you get fresher air, and being on rocks is better in the event of an earthquake. The red is the commoners, and you can see that they're pretty constricted, but they have access to what commoners are deemed to need. That's to say, water access for their trade and along the highways. Now, Edo, in fact, doesn't have many highways. Look at it. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but roads come in from the outside, and when they hit the moat, they just stop. This was for reasons of protection. When the Tokugawa come to power in 1590, there's still a civil war going on. The civil war didn't really end until about the 1630s, and that's what we know. Of course, they thought it might flare up again at any time. So Edo has to be protected. However, you can't have no roads. That would be impractical. So there's one road only really, comes in, well, from inland and along the water where it risks being flooded occasionally, and joins up in Edo, and then conveys through and on down. And if you walk 2 weeks along that road, you eventually end up in Kyoto. So were there to be danger, invasion, brigands, they would come in likely from this side. And the third color coding is purple, and that's the religious institutions. Of course, Japan was and is a Buddhist country, although inflected with local divinities. You may, of course, have heard of Shinto. Today, Shinto is an autonomous religion with its own priesthood and buildings. But in the Edo period that we're thinking of, Shinto was not an autonomous religion. It existed within Buddhism. Almost all Shinto rites were conducted by Buddhist priests, and almost all Shinto temples, almost all Shinto shrines were attached to a Buddhist temple. That's a matter for another day, but the religious institutions here effectively are Buddhist sites. And they are largely grouped in certain areas. But if I go back, you will notice that one here is not marked purple, but this is a temple. So when Edo was created kind of from nothing, it so happened that there was already a temple there, an old one, and here it is marked purple. And of course the monks were delighted about the fact that they had a great warlord who's come here, and of course they sold their temple as having the ability to help him. It had an image inside, and the monks declared this image was not made by human hands, and such icons do exist in Japanese Buddhism. This one supposedly had been fished out of the sea, where it had been, I mean, we today would say somebody had lost it overboard or something, but they thought this was a miraculous discovery. And so the icon was enshrined here, where the monk said for hundreds of years, it's just been of local interest, but now this great warlord has come and pray here. And Ieyasu did pray there, and he almost always won his battles. So clearly this was a wonder-working image of huge significance. That then grew into one of Edo's major temples. You'll see there are other temples, and I'll come back to them in a second about what they are and why they are, where they are. But just to finish off the story of Edo's growth, here we have the city at the end of the period. The shogunal regime would collapse in the 1860s after 250 almost years. So that's it looks like. It's grown, it's spread across the river. The river had originally been the demarcation. The samurai have arrogated much more land to themselves, even though their number hasn't probably increased. Meanwhile, the commoners have been, whose numbers have increased, have been given a little bit more land along the highways, a new commoner district across the area. And I won't talk to you about it today for lack of time, but when you look at the exhibition, I have no doubt there will be a lot of prints of Edo's red light district, which is down here. It's called the Yoshiwara, and this is where the courtesans and the geisha and the woodblock prints and things, drinking establishments were flourished. And you can see, of course, it's a commoner district, so anyone can go there, slightly out of town, because when people get drunk at night, they are likely to have fights and brawls, and then that could cause fires and dangers. So here we have Edo in the course of its rather rapid rise, but its rise was rapid, but it was quite startling that by about 1720 or so, just over a century after its formal foundations, Edo has 1 million people. And although it's not the first city in world history to make 1 million people, it probably was the only city in the world at that point with 1 million people. I mean, London was the biggest city in Europe with more like 300,000 or 400,000. And Kyoto was no bigger than London at that time. So Edo's rise was astronomical. And I'm giving you an art talk, but just thinking in terms of logistics, how to get food in, how to get waste out, how to get building materials, and how to do it all without, think about now, massive cases of plague. A very large dimension of Japanese religious piety is about prevention of epidemics. Edo had a lucky feature here, which is the flip side of its unlucky feature. Because there were so many earthquakes and so many fires, virtually all bits of Edo burnt down every decade or so. It was sad if you lost your house, but it killed all the rats. And so Edo actually never had an outbreak of plague, even though European cities have outbreaks of plague well into the 18th century. So that's the bald introduction, but let me say something about the religious institutions. Of course, the old temple has hugely expanded. That inevitably happens. People make pious gifts, and with so many people, you need a lot of graves. People have to pay for the graves. You need space for them. People are cremated, but you still need space for your family graves. And so that temple has become very big. But you can see next to it, there's another big temple that's been built too. And these two would be and still are, two of Tokyo's important institutions. Now, I told you we're looking kind of south that way. So these temples viewed from the castle are in the northeast, and that's significant. Geomancy, or the way that you build things to regulate the powers of this earth, is very significant in all East Asian urban planning. And one of the principal dictates of East Asian geomancy is that spiritual force, right? The world is filled with things that we can't quite see. Spiritual force moves through the world, and we need to be able to harness it. Spiritual force is not in itself either good or bad, but it takes on the coloration of things it passes over. So if spiritual force passes over the houses of criminals or prisons or brigands, it will pollute the next thing it hits in the southwest. So you always need to purify the northeast. And this accounts for the temples there. Well, it just simply happened, or they probably said it was divine providence, that when Ieyasu built his castle, that temple was kind of in the northeast, but it's not really the northeast, it's more like east. So as Edo becomes more formalized, the shogunate realizes it's here to stay, tax revenues come in, allowing more capacity. They build a second temple next to it, which is, properly speaking, in the northeast. And Kyoto has a temple in the northeast. Other Japanese former capitals have done so too. And this one was built to emulate the one in Kyoto. The one in Kyoto was on a hill, and it was dedicated to a particular Buddha. There are many, many Buddhas, right? There was one Buddha who lived in India about the year 500 BC. We call him the historical Buddha. But there are many, many other Buddhas, and the protector temple outside Kyoto was enshrined a medicine Buddha. You could always recognize him. All Buddhas are the same, right? Because they're all perfectly beautiful. Perfectly beautiful can only be one thing, but you can recognize them by their attributes. And the Buddha of medicine holds a little jar of medicine in his palm of his hand. So if you ever see that, you'll know who it is. And so this older temple didn't have that. It had a different icon. So here they created. And so we have the northeast fully protected. It's unlikely real danger will come in. I told you real enemies will come in from the Kyoto side. So it's spiritual forces which are being purified. And I'll just go back to what I said. I said I wouldn't talk about it, but very briefly, that's why the red light district is there, right? Because the red light district is filled with lustful people wasting their money, right? And that's bad. So passing over this, spiritual force will be polluted, but then it'll be repurified by the temples. So actually the bad things that a city needs are often put in the northeast beyond the temple. Here, incidentally, is the execution ground there for the same reason. So let me show you a couple of images of those two temples. This is the old one. It's a 19th century image, but it would not have changed that much. It has, this is part of a guidebook, two-page spreads from a guidebook. That's why there's the gaps in the middle. And you can see there's a processional highway through a fine architectural gate, which leads you to the main hall. Usually these are called golden halls, in which the principal icon of the temple will be enshrined, right? I mean, churches, of course, are almost always dedicated to a saint. In Japan, you don't have that in the nomenclature, but you do always have a principal devotee, right? And it will be here in the Golden Hall. There's a pagoda, all kinds of halls for other ritual activities. Note here, a Shinto shrine gate, right? It's inside the temple. It's nothing, not outside or anything different. But anyway, the temple is clearly filled with life. Lots of people are passing through. The whole precinct is an exciting environment. Well, that's what the old temple was like. The shogunate decided to give it over to popular devotions. And the new temple, which properly protects their city, was for government use only. And commoners weren't even allowed into the main precinct. Here we have, from that same guidebook, a view of the new temple. I didn't give you the name, but it's called the Kan-eiji, if you want to know. Ji on the end means a temple, the Kan-e temple. And the guidebook has even covered the temple buildings with clouds, right? This is a government temple. You and me buying this book, looking at it, are probably just peasants, commoners. We should not scrutinize power. And it's an interesting feature of all of East Asian art that commoners should not depict elite things. It's also one reason why popular art can be so exciting, because there's whole areas of art that commoners can't depict. So they depict their own lives and exciting things too. Well, all we see is a massive processional way, buildings covered with clouds, and this is some kind of lordly procession that's coming in for some government ritual with a lord riding in a palanquin and standard bearers. So the northeast is protected by these two temples, but although commoners weren't allowed into the central precincts, they were allowed into the outer precincts of the new government temple, the Kan-eiji, and in fact they were encouraged to go there. It was a kind of park space, but not a park in a sort of frivolous kind of way. Within this area, the government gathered in replicas and references to the holy buildings of Japan's past. Edo was new, right? There were sites of ancient devotion across Japan. People could not easily get to them, so they are built in replica. And when I speak to my students in London, I often say to them, you know, there's a tube station in London called Temple, right? Why would there be a tube station called Temple? Because there's actually a replica of the Temple of Jerusalem built there, right? People could not go to Jerusalem on their real pilgrimages, so they could make virtual ones. And so we find that within the grounds of this temple. So here, some of you might recognize this if you've been to Kyoto. Kyoto has a beautiful, magnificent temple built hanging out over the side of the hill. And that was replicated in Edo. Smaller, nothing like so grandiose as the one in Kyoto, but quite striking. And there's on the left-hand side is the one in Kyoto, much bigger, but you can see anyone knows what's being referred to. And beyond Kyoto is Japan's biggest freshwater lake. And in the middle of Japan's freshwater lake is a famous holy temple. Well, it happened that there was a bit of a pond here, can you see? So they built a artificial island in the middle. Here it is. There's that same temple. That, oh, sorry, temple we just saw, right, hanging outside. And then over it, there is the reference to that lake with a holy shrine on it too. And there's a better image of it. So Edo is gathering in, maybe a bit like a colonial city. I don't know anything about, possibly, Sydney, and well, they have references to the old country. These are appearing in Edo too. The temples we saw were in the northeast, but also there was a collection of temples in the southwest. And the government did exactly the same thing here, because as spiritual force comes in from the northeast, of course, it exits to the southwest. And given that danger can come from this direction up from the highway from Kyoto, they decided to build new temples to do the same thing at this end. And they built one commoner temple. If you're traveling down to Kyoto business or whatever, you probably want to buy some amulets and lucky charms. And if you're coming in, you want to thank the Buddhas for protecting you. So that's fine. And next to it is a government temple. So the popular one today has almost disappeared, but the government temple today is still there and it still looks very fine. Its gateway is one of the oldest buildings still standing in Tokyo. It survived all the earthquakes and fires and the Second World War. And that's it. I took that slide a couple of weeks ago, but now this is a period view of it. Inside this temple is a very special image. It's encased in this golden shrine, and the shrine is only open very intermittently. So when it is open, people go and worship it. And what's special about this is that when Tokugawa Ieyasu was still fighting before he became shogun during the Civil War period, he had one battle and it looked quite desperate and people thought he was going to lose and it would be terrible for them. And then some warrior that nobody recognized wearing black robes and armor appeared on the battlefield and fought with great skill and killed many people without taking any injuries himself. And he turned the tide and Ieyasu won his battle. And then Ieyasu asks his generals, find that man, I want to reward him. Nobody knew who he was, nobody could find him, he disappeared. This is very curious. So Ieyasu went back to his tent and opened the doors of his portable shrine to give thanks to his Buddha image for victory, and the Buddha image was not there. So it was the warrior fighting for him. And so that icon, of course, obtained spectacular value and authority, and it was enshrined in this temple in the southwest. So I wanted to say two or three things to you. One is just to set Edo in its place. Second was to talk about the sacralization of the city. But if you'll allow me a little bit more time, there's one further thing I'd like to say, which is that Edo, of course, was a Japanese city, obviously, but as I indicated, it was built at this time of considerable encounter with the rest of the world. And one feature of Edo stands out, which I would like to suggest. This is what I have a chapter on this in my book, if you want to read it, suggesting something rather unique about Edo. It was the first city ever in East Asia that had a city center. Now, most East Asian capital cities, grand cities, built in times of peace, are grids. A grid can hardly have a center. And most other towns were castle towns, so there may be a castle in the center, but 95% of the population can't access the castle, so effectively has no center. Edo was given a center, and that center was located where the two roads meet, right here. So you can see, if you were there, you've got one of the main drainage moats going down towards Edo Castle. And this is a vector towards the west. Now, the center of Edo was not built in the way a European center might be, which is normally speaking a square. That was too dangerous in times when civil war is still in the air. What Ieyasu did is he built the city center as a bridge. And this is a later print, of course, by the famous Hokusai, but it shows you quite effectively the bridge is there. This bridge was added much later, so forget that. Bridge is there, and you look towards the castle. Note that Hokusai has shown much of the castle hidden in clouds, because this is for a commoner audience. We have another lordly procession coming with its halberd, hidden from our gaze. He can hardly not show the shogun's castle, but note how he shows it broken out of the picture, right? It wasn't that he messed up the spatial arrangement of the image. He deliberately shows the castle can't be contained by the practicalities of the picture. And if you do this kind of picture, the government censors say that's okay. So here we have the center bridge completely thronged with people who've, well, it was the only bridge in the city at the time. The only other way to get around was across all the moats was on a ferry boat, which you have to wait for and pay for. It's inconvenient. So this bridge was much traveled, and it was called Nihon Bashi. Right? Nihon, of course, is the Japanese word for Japan. Bashi means a bridge. So the bridge of Japan. And with this, the shogunate is claiming itself as the core of the Japanese state. Until this time, the core of the Japanese state had always been where the emperor was. Even most of the former shoguns had lived in Kyoto, in the capital. But now the center is somewhere else. Hokusai has twisted the picture so that we have this area behind the bridge quite clearly shown too, and he's got a reason for that. This is Edo's fish market, and you can see boats coming in unloading fish. Now, you probably think of Japan as a place where people eat raw fish, and everyone knows about sushi, but sushi is not Japanese food. Sushi is Tokyo or Edo food. You don't eat sushi in Kyoto. It's far away from the sea. You'll get very sick if you try eating. Of course, today it's different, but historically, you don't eat. So sushi, fresh fish, was Edo's claim to fame. And not only is fresh fish delicious and very healthy, it's a great source of protein, but also, of course, Japan has very little animal husbandry. So if you don't eat fish, it pretty much means game, right? Boars and deer and rabbits. There's plenty of that, but it's not like farmed meat, right? So one of Edo's many claims to fame, one of the reasons where the shogun presents himself not just as a warrior, but a warrior who's brought peace and stability, is by the provision of plenty. Nobody starves in Edo. However, a fish market is a bit smelly and commercial. So if you stand on the bridge looking towards the castle, you don't see it. It's part of the organization of the city center, but it's slightly off to the side. If you were to stand on the bridge and look towards Edo Castle, you know it's there, but you don't see it. If you stand on the bridge, you are at a high point. Because of earthquakes, Edo was almost all single story, except for the castle and some temple buildings. So if you were to stand on this bridge, the humpback bridge rises up above a single story building. You look over the entire city and you say to yourself, peace has brought that. Yes, the shogunate was quite a strict regime in some ways, but it had brought peace. And you think of, no, I don't want to raise political issues, you all have your views about it, but think if there are some countries which have appalling governments that at least are stable, and there are some countries that have chronic instability, and probably people would opt for the former. Japan had known a century of civil war. People above all did not want to go back to that. By centering the city on a bridge, the shogunate is not allowing a large public space for congregation, which could give rise to unrest. But a bridge has its own value as a symbol. In Buddhist thought, attaining enlightenment, right? The point of Christianity, I suppose, is salvation, isn't it? The point of Buddhism is enlightenment. And enlightenment is often referred to as reaching the further shore. And monks often say that we're trying to reach the further shore. It's as if we're in a boat with no sails and no rudder and no oars. How do we get there? Right? That's the teaching, of course, of Buddhism, is to learn how to get there. But a bridge conveys somebody safely and without getting their feet wet, infallibly, to the further shore. So Buddhism has a long metaphorical use of the bridge, and the shogunate has built one here, right, in the center of their city. And all the highways going throughout Japan began from this bridge. This is point 0, and all the measurements, it's still the case in Japan, all the measurements throughout the country are from Nihonbashi Bridge, the bridge of Japan. Well, if you stood on the bridge, you could not see the fish market, but there were some other things that would enter into your consciousness, because lined up along this right-hand side, so further from the Kyoto side, in case there was ever to be an invasion, on the right-hand side were 3 of the most important government buildings. They represent the control of the 3 fundaments of rule. One is the control of space, the other is the control of time, and the third is the control of value. So think to yourself while you're having a cup of tea later on, name 3 things a government must do to bring stability. And if you can come up with a better 3 than those, then please email me and I shall tell the shogun in next time I go to his shrine, someone's done better, but it's not bad. Anyway, we have the control, first of all, of space. And interestingly enough, you also have this at Trafalgar Square, right? The colonial embassies are ringed around Trafalgar Square. Japan did not have very many fixed diplomatic relations. It had only relations with Korea, but the ambassadors came infrequently. The Dutch came every year to Japan, and they had their own embassy building, which was called the Nagasaki House, because the Dutch trade in Nagasaki, far away from Edo, but every year they come and offer the shogun presents. And so here we see not many pictures of it were ever made, again, because it's a government building, so commoners shouldn't scrutinize and gawp at it. But commoners did turn up when the Dutch were in town, and here we see Dutchmen with their red wigs, and commoners have come by to view, and there's another image of it. So there at Nihonbashi, we have people come even from the ends of the earth to offer the shogun presents. Why? Because they value the peace he's brought. They understand the morality of his government. They come to learn from him. Well, the Dutch probably didn't think they were coming to learn. They just thought it was very annoying. They had to leave their trade station to give presents, but they made money out of it, so they came. But the Japanese public is built with the fact that these people are coming from the end of the earth to learn. So that's the control of space. The control of time took the form of a bell. Now, temples had bells, but temples' bells rang temple time. It was only with the beginning of peace that the government began to introduce the notion of a kind of laicized time, and the shogun donated a bell, and it was positioned right at Nihonbashi. And every now and again, the bell was lost to fire, and when it was lost, the shogun personally donated a new one. This is the last one from the mid-18th century. Today, it's been put inside a modern, rather unsightly concrete belfry, and it's been relocated to a park where I'm afraid rough sleepers sleep. I spent a long time sitting here waiting for this gentleman to move on, but I think he sleeps there most of the day. So Tokyo has its poor parts like anywhere else, but this bell, anyway, was time is told from here. And when that bell rang, people in far off would hear it, or a runner would go to the next bell and ring that one. So time actually lagged as you went further and further away. And this is a site of true time. I'm not sure if there's such a place in Ireland, but of course in England, it would be Big Ben. Until modern clocks came into existence, you set your time from Big Ben. You can't say Big Ben is wrong. It is the definition of correct time. And thirdly, the control of value. Now, it may surprise you to hear this, but throughout almost all of Japanese history, the government never minted coins. Coins were valued, well, of course, most people just used barter in the villages, but coins were valued according to their metal. So it didn't really matter where the issuing entity was. And Chinese money is used very regularly in Japan. In fact, it's almost the only money. Eventually, the Japanese, interestingly, when they start to make money, they peg it to the Spanish dollar. the real, right, made out of money from Peru. However, the Japanese government, under the shoguns for the first time, they mint their own coin, and it's made in this building here. But being not only a government building, but such a significant one, throughout the entire Edo period, nobody ever made a picture of it, except this one by Hokusai, where all we see is the roofs, which are gold and gleaming, right, for all the gold coin being made in there. This is the last slide I'm going to show you. I'm coming to the end of my time, but we have the same view we just saw already. This is that same bridge, but now we're on it. Oops, sorry, looking towards the castle. The castle is, of course, mostly hidden by clouds. But you can also see how, as the Edo period progressed and the shogunate lost the fear that they might be attacked, they actually allowed trees to grow up in their castle. You don't have trees in a castle if you need to look out, and trees can be set on fire if somebody throws in brands. But this was an indication that the government has moved from a war footing to a peace footing. And finally, you can see, I kept this for the last slide, but if you stood on Nihonbashi and looked towards the castle, behind these storehouses are the bell and the Dutch embassy, but you do see the castle, and you see, of course, Mount Fuji. And there again, people think of Mount Fuji as a symbol of Japan, but it's not. You can't see Mount Fuji from Kyoto. It's 500 kilometers away. You see it from Edo. And in fact, I can see it when I step outside my front door when the weather is good, and it's a pretty striking thing to see. Fuji is a glorious sight, but it's more than just a fine piece of nature. Fu means not in Japanese, and ji has two meanings. Ji can either mean two, not two, peerless. This is not anywhere else. There isn't one in Kyoto, and so much of Japanese culture came from China, but there isn't one in China. Not two, but ji can also mean death. So this is the mountain of immortality. And if you climb to the top, you have a very good chance of prolonging your life. And as long as it stands over Edo, Edo will remain, as Tokyo remains today. So I will now stop my screen sharing, and I'll be happy to hear your questions if I think Mary will be in charge of fielding them.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through the city there. It's such an interesting story, the way that I think it's just so surprising that Edo has such a short history, that it really does come from and explodes into this huge metropolis with all these things going on in a really short period of time, and the art and literature and everything else that flows from it also happening alongside this very strict, very controlling government as well. So a first question here, and just to say to everyone, if you can put your questions into the Q&A box, that's the best place for them. But a first question, and this is definitely a test for history: can any comparison be made with Philip II of Spain making Madrid his capital in 1561?
That's a great question. I mean, honestly, I'm not qualified to talk about that, but the fact that Edo was given this center is certainly linked to European practice. And of course, Philip II of Spain was known by the shogun. I mean, they wrote letters to each other and sent gifts to each other. We know that the first embassy to Japan, from Japan to Europe, which went through Spain, went to Madrid, Escorial, and arrived into Rome in something like, sorry, I don't have the 1580s. And they received as a gift this gorgeous album of depictions of European cities. And that was taken back to Japan, and we know it arrived back. And so it must have been that had some impact. Of course, also Japan has many missionaries going around at this time, mostly Jesuits, but also some Spanish, some Dominicans and Franciscans. And they, of course, would have wanted to talk about the glories of Rome. So some sort of connection is, one can say, has to be there. Unfortunately, we'll probably never find a document about it, but Ieyasu had this brand new idea to build a city with a center. So yeah, thank you for the question.
And I'll follow on from that with, how about the use of Western perspective or linear point perspective in the representation of Edo? Could you say a little about that?
Yes. So the last image I showed you by Hokusai was done in perspective, right? And that came into Japan with the Christian missions in about 1600. But when Christianity is outlawed in Japan, doing anything which lays you open to being accused of being a Christian, even if you weren't, is very dangerous. So people sort of shun all these Western things. It comes back in the middle of the 18th century, which was a great moment of popular printmaking in Europe, and it's the period of the Grand Tour. So people are making prints of Naples and even Isfahan and places. So those pictures went to Japan. Japanese see Western perspective views, and from that begins the Japanese tradition of making their own urban views. Japan had always had landscape painting, but they hadn't had much of a tradition of these urban views, and often done in perspective. And they found them quite funny, so they called them floating pictures, as if the kind of things floating off the surface of the picture, referring to the three-dimensionality of them. So they definitely come in at that period. We know the Dutch brought large numbers of prints. They were cheap to buy in Holland, and they could sell them for a lot of money in Japan. They didn't run the risk of getting damaged en route, so large numbers of them came in. The problem with perspective, I can tell you 1 second further, is that it means the thing at the end is very small, so you kind of have a vanishing point. And that was the problem that Hokusai had in the image I showed you last. I didn't comment on it, but if you go back to that at some point, you can see that he pulled the castle out of the perspective grid to make it float above, a similar kind of ruse to what he'd done with breaking the castle out of the grid of the picture I showed you too, so that he's just showing due deference towards it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely important for the printmakers and artists to show due deference to the shogunate. That will come up in the
you get a nice call from one of the councillors saying, "I think you probably should think again." Yeah. You might be glad to hear the shogunate did not actually execute that many people, but of course there was a massive amount of self-policing.
Yeah. And actually, one of the things I'll just mention as a completely side-related thing, the next exhibition after Edo in colour is going to be Isfahan. So
excellent.
Got two cities on the horizon.
That's great.
That will give you some interesting different perspectives, and Moya's planning all kinds of lovely things for that exhibition. So I've got one comment here, which is that the restrictions showing the government temples in the guidebook remind me of the restrictions in maps today showing prisons and military installations. So it's
very interesting point. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, that's a very good point. So we think of in terms of national security, don't we? That's one of our obsessions today. They would have thought of it in terms of kind of awe, AWE. There is an Edo word, awe, which is brought out all the time for the sense of, overcome with deference in front of things. Yeah.
And the next question: when did Edo become Tokyo, and why did its name change?
Yes. So Kyo, Kyo, as in Kyoto, means the capital. And the definition of the capital is where the emperor lives. So there can only be one. And although Edo became much, much bigger than Kyoto and more important, the emperor lived there. So Kyoto remained as Kyoto. The To of Kyoto means metropolitan. So Kyoto literally means the metropolitan capital. It's kind of tautology. When the shogun is defeated and the emperor moves to Edo to become a modern style monarch, Kyoto can no longer be called the capital. So in fact, they're going to change the name. But the people in Kyoto object and say, we've had this name for 1,200 years. You can't stop it. So okay, Kyoto be called Kyoto, but Edo will be the new capital, which is in the east. It is to the east of Kyoto. So To means east, and Kyo again means capital. The reason why they moved the capital is because by that point, ports and steamships and railways, they need Kyoto will be hopeless. And in terms of when it happened when the emperor moved, which is 1868.
And then, so the next question is, can you just repeat where the center of government was in Edo? And
yes, thank you.
How that related?
Yes. Well, I not repeat because I failed to mention that. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to know. The castle was the center of government. So the shogun personally, don't forget, the shogun is not like Napoleon. The shogun only personally controls about 20% of the country, although obviously that's most of the important cities in that. All the rest of Japan is controlled by regional lords who have their own practices and their own hereditary systems. But those lords have to reside intermittently in Edo so that they can't get up to bad things in the provinces. Hence all those large red samurai districts I showed you. So basically the lords are still administering their regions while they are resident in Edo. It's probably somewhat similar to a French aristocrat living in Versailles, but having to, send reports down to the it's spread out. But most of the administration would be done within the castle. People in paths would be going there. We may call them warriors, and they may wear swords, but fundamentally they become bureaucrats. Road maintenance, tax collection, agricultural assistance, and all those things.
That neatly links me on to my own observation, which was when you spoke about the shogunate controlling space, time, and value.
Yes.
If you like me go into Dublin on the Dart Line, and I always come over by Tara Street, and obviously there you have a very conspicuous 18th century customs house right on the river. So it's also taxes, I think, would come under your thing value.
So actually, that's a great question. And if I'd had longer, I could have shown you there was a building in which tax was paid in rice. So there was a vast storehouse. And in fact, the part of Tokyo is still called in front of the storehouses today. But because rice came in these huge quantities in ships, it couldn't really be on Nihonbashi, which was kind of like on a moat. So that customs house was on the big river. So thank you. Yeah, that's it. Again, it's never made pictures of because it's a government building, but it was there.
I didn't think they'd be missing collecting taxes.
No, they didn't.
So the question here from Carlin, did any design or administrative aspects of Edo that outsiders would have seen on their visits influence the construction or administration of other cities in Europe or elsewhere?
That's a good question. I doubt anything went out from Japan. Of course, once it becomes Tokyo and it becomes the center of the Japanese Empire, then the Japanese colonies, Taiwan and Korean things would have had a lot of influence. But I don't think anything could have gone out because there wasn't any avenue to take it out. Right? The Jesuits and priests talk a lot about Japan when they're there, but the missions are all expelled in 1614, although some priests remain underground. So Edo's only really becoming a city at that point. They talk about Kyoto, but priests going back to Rome aren't in a position to influence. And I think also, unfortunately, Europeans have this Eurocentricity, don't they? That they're not usually, on the whole, very willing to copy things from other people. So it was known about, and there were pictures of Edo and things. You find them in, of course, atlases, but I don't think any influence went out.
And then someone just asking if you could repeat the explanation of the name Fuji, please.
Oh yeah, so Japanese has 52 sounds in the language, of which about 6 are actually theoretical and never used. So I think English has about 300 sounds, doesn't it? And Chinese has about 3,000. So Japan has very few sounds in the language, which means that you're forever making puns. And you can make stupid ones, right?
Or otherwise, I should add.
Yes, if you're learning it as a foreign, as a student, you're forever saying the wrong thing. But actually, puns in Japanese are thought of as capable of, if you can say a double meaning in a sensible way, not in a silly way, then it's a very powerful thing. A lot of court poetry uses puns. So Fuji is just the name of it, but that name can call to mind things which are significant. And fu meaning not, ji means both to or death. Right? Actually, there are many other words, ji as well, but those two invoke something which is meaningful to think of when you look at Fuji. And so it's this kind of hangs together. And Fuji becomes a famous mountain. I have to say, embarrassedly, that it was so holy that women were not allowed onto it until modern times.
And I should add that if anyone does get to Japan, there's a lovely visitor center now by Fuji, which is really worth a visit. Interesting building, interesting exhibitions. And yes, I'm sure you've been out there.
Yes, so Fuji was made a World Heritage Site, right? And they built a very fine building. It looks like Fuji upside down, right? You may see why Fuji upside down, but Fuji is famous for being viewed in the lakes that surround it, of course, upside down. So this very fine. It's both cultural center, isn't it, and also geological place.
And you get to sort of because you go up inside it, they've got the lovely projection. So while you're going up, you're climbing Fuji, and there's sort of like people climbing the pathway behind you and little sounds coming from it. So it's all been really, really nicely done. And there's some very good sake stores around there as well, which the curator guided me towards very kindly. So, I don't know if anyone else has any questions. I have one more question myself, which I would just think might just give Timon a little moment to say something about the layering of Edo. And sort of you've touched on it with Fuji there, but how with Japanese you get this layering, but also with the city and the history and the temples.
Yes, thank you. So of course today I kind of gave you a schematic introduction. Edo was there for 250 more years. So, and it had fires and had changes, and different shoguns come in and want to, do different things. Temples disappear, or so. Of course, it was by no means static, and buildings made of wood, as these ones are, even if there's no fire or earthquake, they fall down and have to be replaced. So Edo was kind of perpetually in shift. And if you'd gone to the city in 1800, there would not have been that many buildings from 1650 left. Right? Of course, we can go to Rome and whatever. I mean, you mentioned the 18th century customs house, and there are buildings, stone buildings last a very long time, but wooden buildings have to be changed, and that can be a good thing. It means it's quite easy to reconfigure a building that is going to have a different purpose, or simply you can dismantle buildings and move them somewhere else if you need to. So Edo is sometimes, there's a wonderful book actually by a colleague of mine called Tokyo City of Stories by Paul Whaley, and he doesn't deny the fact that there is material there, but so much of Edo just didn't disappear in modern times. It disappeared in the course of Edo's own history, not to be seen.
Yeah, one of my friends is a photographer, and he's done a lot of work photographing the rivers in Edo, or in Tokyo, obviously, because you don't see them anymore, because they're largely covered by expressways. So there was talk about lowering the expressway so that Nihonbashi, the bridge, is visible again. And the bridge there today, of course, is not the old wooden one, but it's a very beautiful early 19th century, early 20th century metal bridge. But that I think budget cuts have put paid to that idea, and a lot of those things were aimed at being done in time for the Olympics, and obviously that's not an issue anymore. Yes. No, I think we're waiting to hear about the Olympics, just like we're waiting to hear about the
Don't hold your breath. I don't think probably it's a foregone conclusion, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, well, I think that's all the questions answered. So it just stands for me to say thank you so much again for introducing us to this really fabulous city. And I think that's the more that you find out about Edo and it's how it became Tokyo, how the shogunate planned it, it tells you so much about the times, the people, the politics, and it's such a fascinating time, because trying to pull a country back from all this chaos, all this war, was a huge effort. But then the popular culture as well, so many fascinating things tied together. So thank you again, and we hope to see you someday in Dublin if we can.
I look forward to that. I look forward to happening, definitely. Okay, thank you all for listening. Goodbye.
I'd just like to say thanks to Mary Redfern as well for joining and helping facilitate today, and to keep everyone to keep an eye on their emails, because we'll have some more upcoming events in the next couple of weeks as well. Thank you, Timon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
everyone. Bye. Bye.
Bye.